BIW Radio Episode 3. Just want to talk about some of the classic WrestleMania matches that if you're going to be going back and watching the classic stuff, the classic era of WWE, I would say between 1985 and 2002 could be considered the classic era. That's divided into the Golden Era, the New Generation Era, and the Attitude Era. After that, you get into the Ruthless Aggression Era and beyond. But this is just going to focus on the period of about 1985 to 2002. So here's some of the matches that you can't go really without seeing, in my opinion. And that's all I got to say about that. I'm going to get into it right now in no particular order. But we're going to get into it. First one I got to say is Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3. WrestleMania isn't WrestleMania without that match taking place. Of course, you have WrestleMania 1, where it all began, and WrestleMania 2, which was kind of an experiment with the 3 locations, and some, okay to solid main events for those two. They didn't necessarily make this list. Hogan and Andre, though, at WrestleMania 3 was booked so well with, it wasn't necessarily true at the time, but they were saying that Andre the Giant had not been defeated in so many years, and no one had ever body slammed the Giant at the time, which wasn't true, but in pre-internet days where we don't have access to every last bit of information, you could kind of keep the kayfabe better. And as far as somebody my age at the time knew, that would, if you were young at that time, is what I mean, is you wouldn't know any better. And it was a fun story to be told. And the original irresistible force versus the immovable object, Hogan and Andre. So, everybody knows the story. Everybody's seen that match. If you haven't, you probably should. It's not that it's like a technical masterpiece that the critics would give 5 stars, but it told an amazing story, and it put the hero up against a opponent that seemed impossible to beat. And even in the real side of things, as some of you may know, nobody knew quite for sure what would happen, because Andre always could have said, screw this, I'm calling my own audible, and I'm not going to do the JOB. But it all turned out great, and things really took off from there for many, many years, up until maybe 90, 91. I think the WWF was on fire, for WrestleMania 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 we get into a little bit of trouble because it was the Hogan Slaughter thing, which was tied to the war, and people didn't take that very well at the time, it being timed to the Gulf War and all that, and we don't have to get too into that. Back to the greatest matches, the greatest classic matches that you need to see in order to know your WrestleMania lore. Ones to remember: Hulk Hogan against Randy Savage. WrestleMania 5 would be another one when the Mega Powers exploded. The story started being told 1 year before, all the way back at WrestleMania 4, when Hogan handed the belt to Savage. Savage had won it in a tournament at WrestleMania 4. And of course, it all goes into the story of Hogan having lust for Elizabeth, and Elizabeth being caught between her husband and her husband's, partner, best friend, all that. So there was all of that with the Hogan Savage. They were teamed for a year as the Mega Powers. They were in an alliance, and then everything exploded, and they squared off at WrestleMania 5 for the title. Savage, the champion at the time, defeated by Hulk Hogan, of course. Then over to WrestleMania 6, the year after, Hulk Hogan putting the title on the line against the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior, babyface versus babyface. Nobody knew it was going to happen. The crowd was very split. Hogan had his Hulkamaniacs, his followers, but even some of them were hardcore Warrior fans too that felt torn. Other people, maybe more on the adult side, might have preferred, the Ultimate Warrior. Hogan getting a little bit stale. And, all sorts of opinions. And some people didn't care for either one, because neither one of them were really much of what you would call a great wrestler, but they put on one of the most epic main events at any WrestleMania ever. Just the way they told the story and the way everything went. A lot of people, including myself in retrospect, think maybe the wrong person won on that day, as things turned out, because by WrestleMania 7 they were going back to Hulk Hogan. They tried to anoint the Ultimate Warrior as the replacement for Hulk Hogan, but it didn't work. Years later, it didn't work with Lex Luger. It didn't work with Sid Justice. It didn't work. You know, they thought they were gonna have another Hulk Hogan replace Hulk Hogan. You can't do that, but times changed. There was a steroid scandal, so things started to change. Wrestling started to change, and along comes Bret Hart. But before we get to that, it may not have been the main event at WrestleMania 8, but it was the co-main event. Hogan versus Sid did not make my list from WrestleMania 8, but this match certainly did. Randy Savage going up against Ric Flair. There was a whole story about the doctor's photo. This was before Photoshop and AI, so there was a whole story about how Ric Flair had been with Elizabeth, and he produced all these pictures of him and Elizabeth, and the pillows and the towels have the initials R for Rick and E for Elizabeth, but then they got the negatives and proved that those were doctored fake photos, and it was actually R for Randy and E for Elizabeth, and the photos had been doctored, and Miss Elizabeth was so beside herself. She felt like her reputation had been besmirched and that she would be scarred for life, and it led to a big championship match between the Nature Boy Ric Flair and the Macho Man himself, Randy Savage. Amazing match at WrestleMania 8, one that I might watch back this weekend. And of course at WrestleMania, I think 13, you have I'm not necessarily going in order here, but Bret the Hitman Hart, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Of course, Bret the Hitman Hart going full heel from babyface in that match, and Austin going from heel to babyface, so the double turn. You know the story, absolute classic stuff. Bret the Hitman Hart against Stone Cold Steve Austin, one of the greatest WrestleMania matches of all time. Easy for me to say, one of the greatest matches. The blood pouring out of Austin at the end is absolutely amazing. He passes out. He never truly gives up. He loses all that blood. He's in the sharpshooter. He never says the word "I give up." He never taps. He just passes out. But a hero is made. I don't want to say a star is born, because Steve Austin was a star already when he was in WCW as Stunning Steve Austin with Brian Pillman and the Hollywood Blondes and all of that as well. And that was around 1994, Stunning Steve Austin really rising in the ranks. And then Hulk Hogan came in. WCW signed Hulk Hogan, and things never were the same again. If you watch WCW in that year, a lot of people are hot. A lot of people are being pushed. Stunning Steve Austin is definitely one of those individuals that are being really pushed. But then Hulk Hogan comes in, everything gets rebooted and centered around Hulk Hogan. But nonetheless, and by the way, we never got to see Hulk Hogan against Stone Cold Steve Austin, so we could do a dream match video at some point, but this is just about the best matches. And so WrestleMania 13, Bret Hart and Steve Austin. Also another match, Hulk Hogan against The Rock. That obviously wasn't a 5-star wrestling clinic, but the entertainment and the crowd investment behind it. Proud to say that the Toronto crowd really made that match. They were really into it. There's a lot of nostalgia and history between the city of Toronto and beyond and Hulk Hogan. There was Maple Leaf Wrestling and all of that. Toronto always was big supportive of Hogan at the time. So you know, it is what it is, but there was that connection there at the time. And The Rock, obviously, those two really put on that day the chemistry. Y'all know the story. Hogan went in as the bad guy technically in that, but the crowd was like pro Hogan. They almost switched roles in the middle of the match, called it on the fly, changed things around, because two wrestlers at that level are capable of doing it. That match should be studied for that reason. Another match that should be studied, but for a very different reason, The Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, taking on The Undertaker at WrestleMania. Absolute classic. Flawless. Some people say the greatest match of all time at any WrestleMania. It would be hard to argue against that. For a long time, this next match that I'm going to talk about was absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt. Nobody could argue it one way or another. It was just simply the number one match for many years at any WrestleMania. The Macho Man Randy Savage, once again, this time taking on Ricky the Dragon Steamboat for the Intercontinental title. One of the top matches, absolutely beyond a shadow of any doubt. But I don't know, that HBK Undertaker match, there's two of them at WrestleMania, but that first one especially, I think actually finally somebody put on a better match than Savage and Steamboat. It just depends on the day that you ask me. They're pretty close. There's nothing that comes close to, I don't think, those two matches really. Maybe in innovation there might be something that comes close, but anyhow, we don't want to go too much longer. Another match that I would recommend is Roddy Piper versus Bret the Hitman Hart for the Intercontinental Championship. Obviously not the actual main event, but the story told between those two, both going in pretty much as baby faces. Roddy Piper at the end wants to hit Bret Hart with the bell, but his conscience tells him not to, and he doesn't do it, but it ends up costing him the match, and he loses the Intercontinental Championship to Bret the Hitman Hart. So that is a classic story, a classic match. Absolutely 5 stars across the board for the storytelling, for the quality of the match, and all the rest. The role that Bret Hart played in that match, and the role that Roddy Piper played in that match, and of course Piper giving the belt over to Bret helped solidify him as a single star, and we know where things went from there. Nothing but, sunny skies from there for a long time. So we got Piper and Bret. Piper and Goldust in the unsanctioned backlot brawl. That is something that I definitely have to give more than an honorable mention to. That, I think, is the kind of top 10, but in no order, that I would, there's a few more actually that are equally as important. So it's not necessarily a top 10, and it's not necessarily in any order. It's just ones that I think you can't go without including. So that Piper and Goldust match, for its own special reason, because it was like, nowadays they'd call it a cinematic match, so it was almost before its time the way they filmed that, and they filmed part of it before WrestleMania took place, and then when it broke out into the arena, that part was live, so they had to put back on the same clothes, look as exactly the same as they could, and finish the match. I don't know if anything like that's really been done. Probably, yeah, they started doing things like that again in COVID times, where they would do these cinematic things more, but absolutely ahead of its time. So it's a trailblazer match in that sense, and it's also a great match, just the way they filmed everything. Very different, I don't know how people necessarily took it at the time, but I thought it was like really different, and it fit those two. Those two were probably the only ones that could pull something like that off. Really cool. Dustin Rhodes and Roddy Piper. Anyways, WrestleMania 10, you also have to check out Bret the Hitman Hart against his brother Owen Hart, an absolute classic wrestling clinic. So from that 1985 to 2002 era, that one's a very important one. The main event of that WrestleMania 10 was Bret Hart against Yokozuna, of course. That is a match worth watching, but I mean, if you had to pick one from WrestleMania 10, it would definitely be the opening match, Bret the Hitman Hart against Owen Hart. It's hard to find any flaw in that match. A classic WrestleMania match. You also cannot go without mentioning The Rock against Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania X7. Those two actually fought 3 times at WrestleMania. You probably want to watch all of them, but The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania X7, one of the greatest WrestleMania cards up and down. WrestleMania X7. Don't have time to talk about it here, but absolutely phenomenal. And 2 more at least to get to, maybe 3. I do want to mention Macho Man winning the title at WrestleMania 4 in the main event against Ted DiBiase. Not necessarily the greatest match by any means, but told a great story, and those two can always deliver. And another very important one to mentioned Bret the Hitman Hart against Shawn Michaels in a 60-minute Iron Man match at WrestleMania. You must watch that one if you're going to talk about WrestleMania and the classic period between 1985 and 2002. Also, the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian in TLC at WrestleMania. Maybe not the best TLC of all of them, but the first one, I believe, was... or I think they may have done I think they did a few ladder matches before that and a few chair matches, but the first one with tables, ladders, and chairs, TLC, I think TLC 1, I could be wrong, but I think TLC 1 was at WrestleMania, but whatever it was, the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian, enough said right there. Those three teams so important to one another's careers, and they did magic in those type of matches. And before the TLC came along, the first, well, not really the first, but sometimes they call it the first, they pretended it was the first at the time, ladder match in the WWE, WWF at the time, HBK, Shawn Michaels against Razor Ramon, the ladder match for the Intercontinental title. Shawn had come back. He said he never lost the Intercontinental title, so he had his Intercontinental title. Razor Ramon, who had won the Intercontinental title that had been vacated, he had the what he felt was the legitimate title. Anyways, they put both those Intercontinental titles up in the air above a ladder. Whoever won was going to be the undisputed Intercontinental champion. That it was one hell of a match, the ladder match between HBK and Razor Ramon. We ran a little long for this episode, but I want to thank everybody for checking it out. If you do, that was the list of matches you really got to watch if you're going to check out Mania, the nostalgic era from 1985 to 2002, which consists of the Golden Era, the New Generation era, and the Attitude Era. So anyways, anything you want to get into, any ideas you might have for the channel, let me know. We're just messing around, trying things. Hope everybody has an awesome WrestleMania weekend. Peace out.